This is section 1 of a CDL test. Section 1, front vehicle, lights and reflectors. You say, these are the lights and the reflectors. The lights and reflectors are clean, not broken, and mounted securely. Mirrors. You identify the mirrors and say, the mirrors are clean, not broken, and mounted securely. Engine compartment. Oil level. First you must find the dipstick. Once you have located the dipstick, you say, I pull out the dipstick, I clean the dipstick, I put the dipstick back in, I read the dipstick, and I see that it is at a safe level, not low, not too high. Coolant level. Look at the reservoir container and see the level of liquid inside. Say, I would check the coolant level by removing the radiator cap once the engine was completely cooled off. Power steering fluid. Find the power steering reservoir and check for an adequate amount of power steering fluid. Say, this is the power steering reservoir. I see the hoses aren't frayed, cracked, or leaking fluid. Water pump. Locate the water pump and say, it is belt driven. It has less than 3/4 inch of play. Alternator. Locate and say, this is the alternator. It is belt driven. It has less than 3/4 inch of play. Leaks and hoses. In general, look around at the hoses whenever you're looking and see if there are puddles on the ground that would indicate a leak somewhere in the truck. You say, I'm looking at all the hoses while you're pointing at the hoses and say, I don't see any leaks, cracks, or fraying hoses. I'm looking under the truck, point and look under the truck, and say, I don't see any puddles either. Air compressor. Find it and say, this is the air compressor. It is mounted securely and is not leaking oil. It is gear driven. Automatic transmission fluid. You say, I'm looking at the automatic transmission fluid and it is in the safe operating range. Steering. Steering box and hoses. Find the steering box and say, this is the steering box. It's mounted securely with no missing parts or leaking fluid. I'm looking at the hoses and see no leaks or damage. Steering linkage. Find and say, this is the 3-piece steering linkage. It isn't worn, cracked, bent, broken, twisted, or any loose parts. No missing nuts, bolts, or cotter keys. No, it is not loose or worn around the nuts. Front wheel. Tires. Say, this is a tire. It is evenly worn with no cuts or damage. The valve stem and cap are in place. The steering tires are not recapped and have at least 4 30-seconds tread depth. You say it has at least 4 30-seconds tread depth. Rims. Say, these are the rims. There are no cracks, dents, or illegal welds. Lug nuts. Identify the lug nuts in the center of the tire and say, These are the lug nuts. All the lug nuts are present. They are free of cracks. They show no rust trails or shiny treads that would indicate looseness in the lug nuts. Hub oil seal. Identify and say, this is the hub oil seal, right in the middle of the tire. It has no leaks. The bolts are tight. And if I could see the fluid level, I would see that the fluid level is full. Front suspension. Springs, shocks, and airbags. Identify and say, these are the springs. They are not missing, shifted, cracked, or broken. The shocks are secure and not leaking. Airbags are mounted securely and have no cracks or signs of wear. There are no sounds of leaking air. U-bolts. Identify the U-bolts and say, these are the U-bolts. They are not missing, broken, or loose. Spring mounts. Identify and say, these are the spring mounts. The mounts are not cracked or broken. There is no missing or damaged bushings or broken or loose parts. Front brake. Brake hoses or lines. Identify and say, these are the brake hoses. They are not cracked or worn and have no sounds of leaks, air leaks, or visible fluid leaks. Brake chamber. Identify the brake chamber and say, this is the brake chamber. It is not cracked, dented, and is mounted securely with no sounds of air leaks. Slack adjuster and push rod. Identify and say, this is the slack adjuster and push rod. It is not broken, loose, and no missing parts. The push rod is not moving more than 1 inch while the brakes are released when pulled by hand. Drum and linings, or rotor and disc. Identify and say, this is the drum, and check it and see that there are no cracks, dents, holes, loose or missing bolts, and look for contaminants such as debris or oil or grease. Brake linings are not worn, dangerously thin. They are at least 1/4 of an inch thick.